In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate you joining us at WNX Radio. We know that we're right in the middle of spring planting and everybody is really busy. And today I am in Sioux Falls and I am visiting with Andrew Knutson of the Thompson Law firm just off Western Avenue here in Sioux Falls. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me. I know you're busy.
Thanks for having me.
All good attorneys are extremely busy. So if you weren't busy, I would be nervous, right?
Exactly.
The Thompson Law firm and Andrew specializes in wills and estates. And I've invited him on board because in the Legacy of Agriculture, we talk a lot about people's legacy and the legacy that they have made in their farming, particularly in agriculture. And as the numbers continue to shrink, and as there's becoming less and less farmers, we're finding that there's more and more need all the time for people to especially in production agriculture, to have their wills or their estates or their trusts set up. And I felt that it was very important in order for those good people that have worked for 40, 50, 60, sometimes 70 years to continue that legacy. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to talk about death and we have to talk about retirement and we have to talk about uncomfortable changes. And with uncomfortable changes comes tough decisions. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
Oh, absolutely.
And so I've invited Andrew onto the show to talk about wills. And for those of you out in our listening audience that don't have a will put together or don't have a plan in place, Andrew is your man. And I'd like to have Andrew talk a little bit about how to get started with wills and what to do.
Yeah, that's kind of there's the legal technical aspect of estate planning. And I always say, we call it estate planning and not will making or trust making just because we have to consider so many different factors. And sometimes you can just get bogged down with too many options, too many choices, right? One of the good ways to start from a non-legal perspective is, where is the farm at now? What's the history? How is it? How are decisions being made? And take an inventory. Who is the farm supporting? Who do you hope it's going to support in the future after you retire? And a lot of good estate planning is kind of guiding lifetime transitions, right? We always think of wills as, estate planning and will making. That just must be, okay, who gets what when I die? Well, if you do it well, it can lead to a really, more impactful lifetime transition, and make sure that you are able to bridge that next generation, whether it's to your own child or grandchild or niece or nephew, or even to a third party,
charity,
or to a charity. And farm transition planning is a difficult process any way you cut it. Sometimes it's not always about taxes and wealth. It's really about the practicalities of moving that transition. So one of the things we do in our firm, myself and another attorney here, we're both, we're estate planning and succession lawyers. I've been doing this exclusively for the last 16 years, but I'm also a certified farm transition succession coordinator. So we've worked with families on the practical side of things too, of how do we begin, how do we organize our information, and ask some tough questions, right? Because if you're thinking of taking on another generation, if you're retiring, is the farm going to be supporting you? Is it going to be supporting the next generation as well? And how many families can we realistically support with this operation? And if it means less than 2 or 3, then we have to talk about how to retire.
That's right. How do we make that transition and the one question that almost always gets asked is I got to pay capital gains tax. I've got to pay taxes. So I would never say we're not going to have to pay taxes, but I like to have that conversation is in order to be fair and honest and follow tax code and tax law and do the right things for the right reasons, there really does need to be a very well thought out, prepared for plan.
Yeah, and I have clients that, every farm situation is different, right? And every family has their own issues and dealings. And a lot of times, if we're going to retire, because, there's some farmers that I'm happily going to fall off the combine when I'm 95, right? That's right. What I'm planning to do. And others,
die with my boots on.
Exactly, yes. Others are more realistic about it. And the ones that are come into it, eyes wide open about their options, because a lot of times we start out, okay, if you did retire, what do you need for income?
Right.
And that's all they got to tell me. And then after that, we can actually start planning the most tax efficient strategy to get there, where we can move in the next generation and provide that retiring generation income. Maybe they don't want to fully give up control. So we do have other tools available to us where we can form certain partnerships or LLCs or corporations where you have these different, shares and classes of ownership where maybe you can essentially give most of it away, but still maintain a significant amount of control and be there to, lend that wisdom that you have. I mean, if you're in your 60s, 70s and still operating, you have just a wealth of information that next generation, that 30 or 40-year-old is going to really need to make a successful transition.
So you said something that was very interesting, Andrew, and that's about controlling the estate or controlling the assets, controlling, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so you have some scenarios where maybe mom or dad's just not ready to fully step away yet, right? And they are a little nervous about putting some decisions in the hands of the next generation, right? There's others that are very willing to do it, but let's say if you want to do one where you maintain some ability to help with decision making, let's say the farm land is in a certain type of family partnership and the farming operations are either sole proprietor or in an LLC. You can sometimes arrange those where, mom and dad can start transitioning some of the non-voting, non-controlling ownership to the next generation, right? And so you're starting to, in a tax-efficient way, get more of that wealth and income stream down to the next generation while still sharing decision-making control, right? So maybe you don't own 99% of it, but you do have some voting rights, sort of like staying on as a member of the board, right? Or kind of a decision maker. Because unlike I do business succession planning, for a living, and specifically with farm succession planning, it's just a little different always, mainly because you live at your business typically, right? I look out the window and I see it all day long. So how am I supposed to just let all that go, right?
And it can become very complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's important that you inventory where you're at and have some real conversations. And sometimes if I'm sitting in a room with a family and we're talking about all these different options, experts can help guide you to, boiling it down from a myriad of hundreds of options to, okay, here's maybe the top 2 or 3 best ways to go here for your family. And that's where we try to get you.
Yep. Well, we're coming down to the end of our first segment. I'm with Andrew Knutson of the Thompson Law firm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We're starting a conversation about the transition and how to start preparing wills and that transition and maintaining control. In the next segment, we're going to talk about what is the first step. If I'm sitting at the kitchen table and I have farmed for 50 years and I want to put a will together, what's my first step? So we're going to come back in the second segment. We're at the end of our first segment. For complete listing, we want to do a shout out to our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty, for sponsoring our show today. And we'll be right back in just a couple of minutes.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Folks, we're back in our second segment. I'm Chris Bair, the host of The Legacy of Agriculture. Andrew Knutson from the Thompson Law Firm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota is joining us. You guys are licensed in South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota,
And Iowa.
and Iowa. So if almost all of our entire listening area, you could call into Thompson Law Firm here and they can help you. You give a free consultation, initial consultation on how to get your will started or how to start this transition period. But I would really like to cut this back and make it really simple, Andrew, is I farm. The scenario is I farm for 50, 60, 70 years. I don't have a will in place. I don't know what to do. I've heard the Legacy of Agriculture talk about wills and how important it is in creating a plan. If I'm that person, what's the first step?
It's always with a phone call.
Sure.
But
Yeah. And let's say, 70% of our clients are farmers. We've helped well over 1,100 farm families specifically in the last 21 years. And how do we start is always a good question. So if you scheduled an appointment, for example, we send you questionnaires that sort of help you organize your information. And even if you don't schedule an appointment with myself or some attorney, number one is always organize that information, right? You have to know how things are owned, because how things are titled matters so importantly when you're doing estate planning. You have to analyze the financials and kind of discuss, okay, if I was able to step down, or how many need to be supported by the income from this farm. And then secondly, you got to create a timeline. If you don't have a timeline, nothing gets done. And part of that is maybe if you schedule an appointment, you sort of force yourself to start to get things together for that appointment, right? And whether or not you start with an attorney, some people prefer to start more with a farm succession coordinator or somebody that does more farm consulting to start to help them organize their information so that they have their items together. But at the end of the day, it's if you know how, because a lot of times if I have machinery and I'm farming with someone else or a family member, who owns that machinery? Sometimes we're not exactly positive, or we know, right? I own it with half and half, right? But
yes,
there's typically not a title or a deed with that machinery, right? And so when somebody passes away, we have to know who owned it and how much for the sake of determining cost basis for tax purposes and these other things that really impact our tax situation if we ever did have to sell that piece of machinery or redepreciate it.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of people miss out on, is that if you plan it right, a lot of this machinery that you fully depreciated can sometimes be redepreciated after a death.
And it can also become very complicated. Like I remember my dad saying, now when my dad passed away, he had a will. The transition period was okay. He had a will and he had a plan. But the scariest conversation that a child can have with the parent is when the father says, I don't care what you do with it after I die. That's a dangerous spot to be in, because if there's no will put in place or there's no paperwork in place that tells what, and there's an unexpected death, there's a heart attack or an event that is not good, then it goes to probate and a judge decides what's done with that estate. And it can become really complicated, especially when, say, a father and a mother are 70 years old. They have a son that has farmed with them for 25 years, but there's 3 other siblings that have not been on the farm, but there's heirs to the estate. They're heirs to their mother and dad's estate. So that's a really big reason to have this type of planning in place.
Oh, absolutely. And it's, a lot of times if some people, they say, well, we avoided probate, or everything went smoothly. And a lot of times but you missed a lot of opportunities perhaps,
sure,
right? That you didn't know about to maximize the tax efficiency. And when you're looking at farm families now, 40, 50 years ago, if I wanted to get into farming, maybe I could have went out and bought some land, bought some machinery, and tried to cash flow my payments. I don't think I could do that nowadays, right? So either to have a successful farming operation, you either have to have a good deal or inherit a little bit of it. It's just based on the reality of land prices now, right?
Yep.
So it's just not going to cash flow unless you plan it right. And that's more of an issue now than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So that's become a really important thing. And then also, if you have 4 children and it's going to be undivided land ownership, anytime you fractionalize the land, you put the entire farming operation at risk. Right. And most of the times when I see family farms fold, it's because of undivided ownership. Because a lot of people don't realize, if I leave a quarter section to my 4 kids undivided, a single one of them can force a sale of that. It's called a partition action. A single one of them.
Let's talk a little bit about that in South Dakota, because we have so many South Dakota listeners, and there's people that are a little bit unfamiliar with the law. Explain that law in a little bit of detail, Andrew.
Yeah, so let's say if 4 children all were co-owners, undivided, of a section of land, right? A single one of them can force a sale through what's known as a partition action. They can go to court and say, hey, judge, I want you to split this land up 4 ways. And the judge says, well, I can't split it exactly in 4 ways. It'll be perfectly even. So therefore, law defaults to an auction. And I can go force that issue if I'm an undivided owner. And a lot of people might think, oh, no, it needs a majority vote, or it needs... And the other thing is, if they don't want to force the issue, sometimes it gets forced for them. If one of them is going through a divorce, now that section becomes part of that divorce and can be forced to sell. Bankruptcy, same way. So there are, entities like land companies and trusts that you can put this land into, where it's the landowner is now this entity, this partnership, or this trust. And within there's all these rules about when you can sell, who can sell, and it protects it from creditors and lawsuits and divorces, with the whole point of keeping that land together for the farming, family.
Right.
Because even if you have everybody that gets along well, divorces can still happen. Things like that can happen. And even if you split the land up where everybody has their own quarter, well, are they obligated to rent it to the farming family? And even if they would be willing to, eventually they might pass on or have a liability or an issue. And there's always going to be an argument. Even if 2 siblings get along great, the farming sibling might have a different opinion about what that rent should be paid versus the non-farming kid.
Yep. Well, that plan, and to go back on my experience in the auction industry over the last 30 plus years, is it's always interesting to go on, and I did a farm retirement sale last fall where a husband had unexpectedly died. He was in his 60s, but he had a very well planned out, executed plan, and in the process that his wife had to deal with it. It's always the spouse that has to deal with it. And in the midst of the grieving process that she was going through, there was a plan that they had both agreed on. Not only what should happen in the event of his death, but what should happen afterwards, and exactly what needed to be done. So the decisions really were already made, so that it allowed her to go through the grieving process and grieve the death of her husband, but yet have a lot of peace and comfort knowing that there's a plan in place. So all she had to do really is start the wheels in motion of a long-term plan. And then on the other side of the coin, I've been in situations where you roll out to a farm, you have a grieving widow, there wasn't really a plan. There's kids that are giving information. There's neighbors that are giving information. The church ladies down the street are giving information.
I would say that your practical point is really, really important. Good planning. When you lose a spouse, you have a good year of fog to deal with in your brain. And when you have a plan in place, it really helps.
Yep. We're coming down to the end of our second segment, and I want to continue down this road about the planning portion of it and being properly having a proper plan put in place. That's a lot of P's, right? And we're going to be back here in just a couple of minutes. This is the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm your host, Chris Bair. We appreciate Pfeiffer's for sponsoring the Legacy of Agriculture. Nobody, absolutely nobody, does it better than Pfeiffer's. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeifers. Nobody does it better.
Hey folks, it's Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us. If you missed us on WNX Radio, you can join us on Apple, Spotify, and now YouTube. My guest today is Andrew Knutson from the Thompson Law firm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that specializes in estate planning. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. We've had a great first two segments talking about the importance of wills. But before we go any further, let's define some things, because sometimes me not being a law person, what's the difference between a trust? What's a will? So would you define for our listeners what a will is, what a trust is, and define some of these topics that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you have your fundamental estate planning tools are powers of attorney, wills, and trusts. And, powers of attorney, those are documents that who can make your decisions if you can't, but you're still alive.
Okay.
Right? For financial or health, for example. The second is a will. A will is a meaningless piece of paper until you die. And then when you die, the will says what happens to your estate. And really, it only controls what is part of your estate, meaning that, things that have a beneficiary designation on them, like a life insurance policy or an IRA, that beneficiary designation will control over what your will says completely. And if you have jointly owned property with rights of survivorship, that controls over what your will says. And then so the will says who can make your decisions after you're gone, and that person's a personal representative. They used to call it an executor back in the day. Okay? Yep. And then there's trusts. And when somebody says, I have a trust, that doesn't tell me much information. Okay. It's like saying I have an animal. Well, is it a cat, a dog, or is it an ostrich, an emu? Okay. So there's a lot of different types of trusts. And they can be a little confusing because there are so many different types, but there are a few things that are true about every type of trust. Every single trust has a grantor that creates it, a trustee that manages it, and a beneficiary that benefits from it. And a trust is kind of like an artificial person. It can own things. It can do things, anything a person can own. But you can think of the relationship sort of as, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and if I said, okay, I'm going to be busy, and I say to my friend, please take her out to a movie, here's $100.
Right.
That's a trust. I'm the grantor with the $100. I create it. I give it to my trustee, my friend.
Who you trust.
Who I trust, absolutely. Yep. I got to trust my trustee. And my friend, she needs to use that money for the benefit of my daughter to take her to the movie. So my daughter's the beneficiary in that scenario, right? And every trust has to have at least those three parties. And sometimes you can be all three of those. A single person, like in a revocable living trust you might have heard of, is a typical estate planning tool we use to avoid probate. Okay. And say it's kind of controls the who gets what when I die.
Right.
And so every trust is either revocable, meaning that the person that created it can just unilaterally change it whenever they want, or it's irrevocable. An irrevocable trust, or irrevocable, depending on how you want to say that.
It depends on where you're from.
Exactly, right. I like to say irrevocable. But it really, that means the grantor, the creator, can't just unilaterally change it, although there are ways to change those types of trusts. But irrevocable trusts can do things that, a revocable trust is really a probate avoidance tool. It's not providing you any asset protection. It doesn't change your taxes at all. Whatever's in there is technically part of your estate for estate tax purposes, for example. But you completely avoid probate. Where irrevocable trusts, and there's many, many different types, those can accomplish things like asset protection or protection from nursing homes, or even specialized tax planning where I can remove assets out of my estate for tax purposes.
Into a trust.
Yeah, and so irrevocable trusts, you can accomplish a lot of different goals. And one of our jobs is, if we help you kind of figure out the 30,000-foot view, right? And then the details are our problem on how we get there, and that's what we work through.
Okay, so I have a question. If I have a trust put in place, does a trust allow me to have less risk in an event because the trust owns certain assets, but I don't own certain assets. You understand where I'm going with that?
Yeah, and so it depends on the type of trust, right? So if I have a revocable living trust and I have everything titled in it or designated to it, I'm going to avoid probate. After I die, everything's going to move quicker and smoother and a lot less expensive than if I had to do a probate, right? And then, yeah, different types of trusts can accomplish different things. Like I said, you can use trusts for avoiding Medicaid and trying to qualify for, Medicaid to pay for nursing home care or asset protection, trying to protect myself from, a lawsuit or something.
Or an accident or something
Exactly,
an event that could just come in life and that's kind of where I was going with that is that a trust can protect my assets in the event of something that's happening that is out of my control.
Yeah, and the nice thing about, you alluded earlier to having, if you don't have a will, essentially the laws of the state and the court are going to say what happens to your stuff, right?
Right.
And it's a very expensive way to get there, where, trusts make their own rules. So the law in all of our states, defaults in trust law, we kind of default to the terms of the trust instrument itself, right? So a lot of times in that trust can be very unique because I can spell out my own rules in a lot of them. And a lot of times we do that, especially with farming families where I have maybe a farming kid and a non-farming kid. Well, the trust can control a lot of the situation about who gets rights of first refusal, purchase options, what rights the non-farming kid has. So we can limit them. So maybe we just want them to get a rent check in the mail and not really have anything to do to affect my operations. So
Right.
The nice thing is I get to set my own rules.
Yep.
Last night you did a great seminar that talked about trust, and one of the things that really captured my interest that I really liked was as you talked about charities, and that you could put your asset into a
Charitable remainder trust.
charitable remainder trust. That's right, and that trust could manage that money. Say you put $1 million into this trust, and you could put somebody in charge of that and say, I want this trust to generate the next $1 million to be distributed to the heirs. And then you still have that $1 million that has been preserved, whether it's in the form of cash or whether it's in the form of some type of an asset like land or whatever that might be. That was really a neat aspect to preserving a legacy, because that's what we're trying to do, right?
Yeah, there are ways through charitable remainder trusts where you can put assets into it and receive more back, and then after you're gone, certain assets can go to charity, and something that we can certainly get into. But yeah, it's like
It's
a
interesting.
5-minute conversation. Yeah.
Well, that's the tough part we have. Hey, folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment. I'm with Andrew Knutson from the Thompson Law Firm. I'm Chris Bair, the host of Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate our sponsor, Pifer Auction and Realty. For a complete list of all the auctions that we've got coming in 2024, go to our website at pifers.com. Nobody does it better.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pifer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pifer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit pifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pifer's. Nobody does it better.
Folks, this is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate you spending your time with us. We are on WNX Radio, broadcasting on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock. We're also on Apple, Spotify, and now YouTube. And my guest this week is Andrew Knutson from the Thompson Law Firm. Thank you, Andrew, for being on with us. We've had a great first 3 segments, and we're into our 4th segment, and it always seems like it takes a while to get going on the first and second segment, then we run over on time on 3 and 4. But we talked about positive scenarios, but I want to talk a little bit about maybe some negative scenarios and the importance of putting a plan together, a succession plan together. And I've in my experience in the auction industry, I've seen a number of times where there's been a unforeseen event where a husband passes away, or a producer or a farmer passes away, or a father passes away, and there's not a will put in place, and it becomes extremely chaotic really fast, because oftentimes farms have been passed down from generation to generation, and particularly when there's multiple children that are involved, one child or one sibling stays on the farm with mom and dad, the other three go and go out and make a career, but they're all heirs to the estate, and then all of a sudden something happens to mom and dad, and there's not a succession plan. And of course the child that has stayed on the farm says, I've been here all of my life, and the others say, well, that's true, but you've benefited from being here on the farm all of your life. You've raised a family, and there's been benefits there to this. However, and all of a sudden we go out and book a farm sale, and I get telephone calls from three siblings saying, not quite so fast. So that is the exact scenario that we want to try to avoid and educate people towards preserving their legacy. We want to preserve, because oftentimes there's an old cliche out there that says, mom and dad lived poor and died rich. They worked all of their lives. They finally got the land paid off, and land prices have skyrocketed. And even if they're not on the farm, just the land is the greatest asset. And all of a sudden, you've got $5 million or $1 million or $10 million or whatever that number is worth of farmland, and one sibling says, no, we're going to do this, and the other three say, no, we're going to do this, and all of a sudden there's an enormous squabble that splits the family. However, if there had been proper planning and mom and dad's needs and wants were known, a lot of the squabbling could have been prevented by good communication and having a plan put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it, I've seen it all the time. And there are so many tools available to not only solve that issue of, fractionalization and the non-farming kids wanting to sell. And in your scenario, you'd say, that the farming kid, it's like the non-farming kid's like, yeah, you benefited from being on the farm. And the farming kid's gonna be like, yeah, I woke up at 5 a.m. and I've been working really, really hard and I paid my dues. And some families have to realize, I want to treat all my kids fairly. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean equally, right? Because fair doesn't necessarily mean equal. And there's so many other tools too for lifetime transitioning. Because it's the who gets what when you die. Plenty of good solutions for that. But I like to talk to people too about, navigating lifetime transitions as well. And I think, any attorney in the country will happily write your will for you, right? But there's a reason that estate planning and succession planning is a specialty. And there's just, we've seen a lot of DIY plans go awry. And
that's right.
Typically when somebody says, I'm just going to I'll have it done, go to LegalZoom.com or something and print it out.
Oh, don't ever say that, right?
Yeah, right.
Don't ever.
Well, for me, I'm just like, well, the attorneys are going to make a lot more money in the long run when everything blows up. So,
stay off from Google when you're doing a will, right?
Yeah. And and even recently there's so much misinformation out there. And, we have a lot of tax changes coming up, and starting January 2026, we're going to have a lot of changes in the tax code due to some laws that are sunsetting. And so, the federal estate tax exemption, everybody that dies is subject to federal estate tax, and we all have a coupon to use against it. And that amount is going to get cut in half, our coupon, in 2026. And so there's some people that have to do some planning. Plus, all of our income tax rates are going to go up 2 or 3%. Now, we have an election coming up, and there's going to be all sorts of fun stuff to talk about regarding that. And so it's just the way the law is currently written, though we have some big things on the horizon. And so, we're having seminars for our clients like we had last night. And there's been so much interest, we've had to add more seminars. We're doing a seminar next Wednesday night as well, just because of telling people of not only the taxes, but there's just been a lot of recent new laws that have come into play that kind of can give you more tax efficient options. Maybe you have an estate plan and it was all great and you put it together 10 years ago. Well, there's been some law changes since then that you could take advantage of. It doesn't mean that what you had is wrong. It just means maybe it can be a little better.
Yep. And the best, absolutely 110%, the best way to keep politics and the government out of your estate as much as possible is to have a good plan put together to keep them out. Exactly. Follow the laws. Yeah. I'm all about laws and following laws, and I'm about paying taxes, but a good plan could make a difference in hundreds of thousands of dollars that you have to pay in.
I literally just earlier this year, a family came in and, when you die, the IRS doesn't care about what your production value is or your assessed value. They only care about fair market value, right? That's correct. So with farming land prices, what they're at right now, I had a family that, based on their current plan and how much their land was worth now, they were going to owe about $2.8 million in estate tax when they died, okay? But by utilizing some tools like land companies, family partnerships, these kind of things, and a specialized trust, we were able to have a plan that would reduce the value of what they have on paper, essentially, and get things to the next generation. And through the planning, right now, based on current law, because they took advantage of these tools, they're going to owe zero taxes. So we literally saved $2.8 million, right? Yeah. And that's huge. That's great not having to write that check after you're gone, right?
Well, Andrew, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our show, but I want you to talk a little bit about Thompson Law, and tell us just a little bit about your attorneys and how our listeners can get a hold of you to start this process.
Sure, yeah, it's cathompsonlaw.com or just Google Thompson Law Sioux Falls and you'll find us. Also on our website, you can find links to sign up for our seminars, which are free as well, and so you can register right there online. You can call us at 605-362-9100, 9100. And yeah, we've been doing specifically farm transition planning for 21 years. We have 5 full-time attorneys. We have 1 part-time attorney who's also the professor of trust and estates at USD Law School, and so we do stay on the cutting edge of this stuff. Nice. And we're here to help families, specifically farm families.
I went to one of your seminars last night, and they're free. Mm-hmm. And I learned a lot. It was very interesting. I planned on coming back. You had an overflow. You had to go into 2 different rooms. So, hey, we appreciate it. And Andrew, thank you very much for joining us on The Legacy of Agriculture. We're at the end of our 4th segment. We'll be back next week. You can go to legacyofagriculture.com, Apple, Spotify, and now YouTube, and listen to our show. And for if you want to reach out to the Thompson Law, go back to our website and listen to the podcast, and you can get it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
And here now, I'm going to do now. I'm going to be on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605-836-2277.